Hello everyone, today we talk about Frederick II of Hohenstaufen's Imperial Majesty ideology. This is not the first video we made about Holy Roman Imperial Majesty ideology. We talked about that in general for mostly the 12th century, right? I made a video specifically on that, that mostly focused on Barbarossa's ideology. From, of course, the various charters, the documents he issued, so the public face, and what he meant to be for the world at that point. And recently I made another video exactly about the renewed role of imperial glory, right? In the same, basically in the same Swabian era. Right, the second half of the 12th century, focusing again on how they were mostly toying with the concept, given what had occurred politically. Mostly we focused that it was a video specifically on the Kingdom of Germany, right? So it didn't address broader issues. It was mostly about the royal majesty, right? But of course, in the wake of the imperial mission, given that, however, that started from Germany. Today we talk about Frederick II. So naturally there is an important connection there because, as you know, not only he was Holy Roman Emperor, but consequently of course, King of Germany, King of Italy, King of Burgundy, King of Jerusalem too, that he recovered from the Egyptian Sultan Al-Kamil. But he was also King of Sicily. He had this mixed legacy, literally in his blood. Given that the Normans from his mother's side were also deeply imbued with a sense of imperial grandeur, because not much they were just papal vassals, so they were somehow the favorites of the highest spiritual authority, but they had been influenced a lot by Byzantine imperial ideology in southern Italy. And trying to compete with the Byzantines, as you know, so in the Holy Land with the Principality of Antioch, and so on. I made a video about Otto III's imperial ideology, I think last winter, which has a lot to do with Frederick's experience because of his Italian rule. I mean, the fact that he fundamentally ruled from southern Italy that technically was not even part of the Holy Roman Empire. At least the Swabians tried to make it look a bit so, but there were too many things going on, and especially at the time of Frederick, let's say many things were starting to fall apart, especially in Germany. And again, I made lots of videos about Frederick's reign in all these countries, and more or less what was going on. The German reality was going towards a privatization, right? Frederick began literally to sell public rights in exchange for territorial acquisition from the local princes. Southern Italy would maintain actually a great importance, not just throughout all Frederick's reign, naturally the threat he could pose to the papacy, to the Lombard League, in fact, Mediterranean dimension, again, that had brought him to the partial success of Jerusalem, as a matter of fact, and that would continue also under his heirs, right, Conor IV, Manfred, and so on. So, as you know, the Kingdom of Sicily had been very well administered historically by the Hauteville. There had been difficulties that actually revived at the time of Frederick's minority. As you know, again, I made so many videos about all the passage, like from Otto, from Philip of Swabia, Otto of Brunswick. I made a video specifically about Swabian Sicily and also about the Norman one, for that matter, and the Angevin one. So there is all the crossroad of Bouvines, of Philip IV, etc. So it's really one of the single most, if not probably the most crucial moment in in medieval European history, let's say, for all the countries involved, from England, in fact, to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And I'm not going to spend myself too much on that because I assume that the context is clear after all these videos are made. In any case, there is a Swabian history playlist. You can find all what you want there. This video will end up there into it. There is probably a playlist on Frederick II. In any case, the main deal of Frederick as an emperor and as a ruler of all these countries is obviously affected by the fact that he actually lived south of the Alps, right? The Kingdom of Sicily fundamentally encompassed Sicily, the southern and parts of the central Italian mainland. It was well connected with all a series of, especially northern Italy, and all the relation with the papacy, as you know, was strained enough throughout most of Frederick's rule. So what we will see today is mostly one of the highest affirmation of imperial majesty, and especially of direct divine appointment without intermediaries, ideally, but still within the concept that Frederick was, of course, the protector of the church and all the stuff. So we're already acquainted to this, but it's the degree, right, by which certain ideologies were stressed, that it's really fascinating for a ruler like Frederick, right? So Frederick built really lots of new residences in southern Italy, such as the famous Castel del Monte in Apulia. And like Otto III, he regarded Italy, with the city of Rome, as the empire's terrestrial center of gravity, right? At this point, even though the situation was a bit different from the one of Otto III, definitely still the idea of the Germanic emperors was to rule from Rome, right? To rule from Italy, that of course offered much greater advantages than Germany, that at this point would basically be dealt with as a sort of peripheral province, rather, and thus having to justify this passage by stressing further the Romanity of the empire from an ideological point of view. And that's why the most important assertion to be found repeatedly in Frederick's charters is that, of course, his authority was celestially bestowed, right? That there was a centrality, of course, in the imperial role on earth that came straight from God. For example, there's this passage that says that the Lord of Lords, glorious in his majesty, who created the kingdoms and established the empire, who placed us above kings and kingdoms, and raised us to the imperial throne, etc. So the phrases like these naturally stressed the universality of the empire, the fact that literally the imperial majesty was above, of course, the one of any other ruler on earth, and that in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, so what had basically stabilized with this kind of Central and Southern European axis, was to actually encompass any other realm on Earth. It's literally a different rank, right? Empires rule over different kingdoms. Kingdoms are less than that because the empire is exclusively heavenly, universal. It's something that basically is meant to encompass the entire globe, and it cannot be anything less than that. If not for unfitness, fundamentally, of the ruler, whoever covers the office. This naturally was understood universally at the time, except, of course, differently from the time of Otto III, except that by this point, the empire had limited itself fundamentally to this, just to a sum of kingdoms, of realms that recognized more or less loosely, not much they recognized the empire as such, because nobody could live thinking outside of that. But that were, of course, not the entirety even of Western Christendom, and that also within the same countries were essentially opposing the same emperor's rule, or better, the rule of he who held the office of emperor. This is the case of the Lombard League, the case of the same papacy, the same case of German princes that were rebellious to the emperor, even Frederick's son, Henry, famously enough. So that's all a story we've already seen. What I'm saying here is that, of course, by the beginning of the 13th century, the process of creation and consolidation of feudal monarchies on de facto national base had fundamentally eroded the factual capabilities of the empire to extend over the entire Europe. This arguably existed from quite a long time. I mean, the largest empire after the Roman had been the Carolingian one in the West. Then, at the time of Otto III, we see this revival that connected, in fact, Germany with Italy and basically stabilized what we call the Holy Roman Empire as such, with lands like Burgundy and Bohemia too. And in the time of Frederick, instead, the situation was even more deteriorated, as we've seen. Basically, the projects of centralizing monarchic government in Germany was unfeasible. Right, at best they could hope to hegemonize certain parts of the country. Specifically, the Hohenstaufen were interested in Austria and to the fortune of the Babenberg, and I made a video about medieval Austria, because for obvious reasons, not just because they were Swabians and they were already in the south, but by essentially incorporating southeastern Germany as a private asset, they would have controlled the entire Alpine arc, and so the crossings with Italy and so on. This was a problem in Frederick's reign, because at times, for example, the Brenner Pass was blocked by the Lombard League. He had to take other roads, and this was really distressing in many ways for a sovereign that was claiming, in fact, universal rule. Frederick Barbarossa, his grandfather, had gone pretty close to affirm, at least in as far as the German potential during the Middle Ages was concerned, probably a universal dimension of the Holy Roman Empire, right? The only other power later on that could aspire to that would be the Angevins, after they knocked out the Manfred out of southern Italy. But as you know, things went differently after Legnano, and even though the Hohenstaufen had managed with the Norman marriage to simply inherit the throne of Sicily, at this point what you have is fundamentally a sovereign, here Frederick ruling as a Sicilian ruler, and from there having an immense power indeed. So trying to extend his control, especially on Italy, and securing the connections, of course, with the rest of the Mediterranean, especially with the Outremer states that mostly were looking at Frederick as the only person who could save them at that point, because our, say, national monarchies were not so interested even in that endeavor so much anymore. So there were really complicated times, and as you know, also Frederick basically emerged defeated multiple times on the battlefield by the Lombard League, and the entire thing died, if not with him, but let's say with his blood that was apparently quite of a curse, if you see what happened to his children, and finally to the young Conradin later on. It's basically just a devastating picture, right? But you cannot unsee the romantic mythology behind the House of Swabia, and so what effectively also German nationalism later on, probably because there was by the 19th century not much of a Swabian power, if not in history books anymore, would always would always embody the grandeur of the empire, because objectively during the Middle Ages they were the ones that peaked, right? So Frederick, again, I'm talking hopefully to an audience that has, if not listened to my videos on Frederick II, but knows well his history, so I don't have to present the man that was an extraordinary talent, a man of great knowledge, of intelligence. He spoke many languages. He got interested in science. He composed treatises, poems. Like Frederick's Sicilian court is basically the top of 13th century Europe. So the Stupor Mundi, the Poor Apulia, right? All names that echoed in at that time, right? In a world like Sicily that had been traditionally a bit like despised by especially by the French and the German crusaders on their southern Italian way to the Levant, because of course of the idea of the ancestral idea that the southern world was somehow more exposed to the Teutonic Pelasgian influences, the proximity with the Muslims, right? So the greatest prey, actually, the fertility, think about the Sicilian grain, the exports here everywhere in the Mediterranean, that this quite advanced and efficient Siculo-Norman administration that the Swabians had inherited, but that somehow had the power to corrupt the most, right? To push to the extremes, but when failing big. And this is a bit the history of Frederick and his enormous ambition that he legitimately had inherited by blood, by just the fact that he was the Holy Roman Emperor, but that was constantly challenged throughout his entire reign by the other forces, right? The papacy, and the emerging, the communes, other nations, whoever was, of course, acting, saying, if this is the emperor, he should be ruling everyone, right? If he can't, it's his own problem. Again, I already discussed this mostly in the video about the 12th century Imperial majesty, in which we have seen how there were doubts regarding the fact of why, for example, the Germans had now de facto monopolized nationally the Imperial title and so on. But some went by that for political convenience sometimes, but others were mostly just looking at Frederick as the greatest ruler of the time, still one that had his own political territorial limits and did. So it's likely, by the way, that Frederick was familiar with probably an advanced, like even a more developed sense of imperial majesty from his Sicilian upbringing, because of course his maternal forefathers had deliberately employed Byzantine imperial imagery, right, and materials to underpin the prestige of their own relatively parvenu kingship, but that in their view, again, having entered that world, had to compare with Constantinople. And actually, almost, given that the Siculo-Normans were by far the single most dangerous power to Constantinople as soon as they basically existed, and they had been, even Frederick's father, so we're already talking about the Swabian rulers of Sicily, had basically died just before leaving for an expedition to capture Constantinople, which would have likely succeeded, right? Just a few years before, what literally happened in the Fourth Crusade with the French and the Venetians, right? So that was a world where still lots of things were feasible, right? And especially from this hell of a trampoline that the Kingdom of Sicily was, as far as basically the invasion of any other Mediterranean land was concerned. So the Holy Land chiefly, but also in fact the Eastern Empire, and all what this entailed in terms of the reunification of the Roman Empire. And as we'll see now, what really had been concentrated throughout all these legacies was what we have repeated ad nauseam, that everybody must understand mandatorily for any understanding of the Middle Ages, that the only possible empire at the time was Roman, right? The Holy Roman Empire was not another thing from the Roman Empire. It was literally Roman in the sense that they believed that they were Roman emperors. They were the direct continuators of Augustus' empire, right? And Frederick especially, right? If you read Kantorowicz, Abulafia, but in general, we know what his ideology was about. Pure Romanity, right? The Catholicization of the Roman ethnos as the sole possible empire existing in the world. Catholic both in the Roman traditional and in the Christian evangelical sense. For obvious reasons that we'll explain now, because there are literal documents that say it out loud. Then, naturally, there were some political events that also shaped Frederick's view of his reign and a bit the conception of his imperial rule. For example, on the eve of his departure for the crusade, right, finally, 1228, 1229, you know, he had tried initially, then plague had broken out in the fleet. They had to come back to Apulia. But finally, Frederick managed to bargain essentially the nominal possession of Jerusalem, and in exchange for basically the absence of a military escalation in the Holy Land. Jerusalem's walls were raised so that the Egyptians could come back there, but the thing was a way to tell the papacy, look, we made it, even without shedding blood. And naturally the papacy was not very happy about that in the first place. Not much because, of course, a conquest would have been more proper on a long-term acquisition of the same Jerusalem. But of course, because Frederick had contingently acquired a lot of prestige, right, in spite of the difficulties that he met with in Palestine and everything. But what matters really is politics, right? And so how these things are received and how this can aggrandize your own power. Well, when he was about to leave for the crusade, Frederick had commissioned. He was in Apulia, because that's where he had to leave from. He commissioned decorations for the Cathedral of Foggia. That was the principal imperial residence in southern Italy, including in the cathedral a relief of Constantine the Great's victory over paganism, right? Which sounded, spot on, given the fact that now Frederick had vowed to free the Holy Land from Islamic domination, right? So remember at the time that even this Catholic ideology doesn't see any other religion but a sort of aberration still of the universal one. And technically speaking, it is correct, meaning that, of course, the Muslims were perceived not as, say, like today, like, there are various cultures, we're just different, everything is the same. They literally thought that that Islam was a schismatic, accident, right, a Christianity gone wrong, and that thus, all the Crusades and the fact that, the Turks had seized Jerusalem, the holy places of Christ, and everything was due to of course, coming short of the Catholic faith per se. It's also, and obviously, the recognition of the Christian Empire. This is crucial as well. When Frederick entered Jerusalem himself, he staged a crown-wearing ceremony in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. By the way, there were lots of issues because he was excommunicated at the moment, so that's all another thing. It doesn't matter. The important thing here, maybe exactly because of that, to affirm further his imperial dignity, he issued a long manifesto which proclaimed his imperial mission as bestowed directly by God, which naturally, as we were saying before, skipped essentially the papal medium, right? And this was stylized in the manner of King David's kingship. We have said it many times in the Carolingian history videos, Charlemagne was fixated with David, right? Basically, he had more of an Old Testament than New Testament idea of kingship. He loved bloodshed, the Lord God of battles, right? So what an 8th century Frank was fundamentally about, iron, horses, bloodshed, right? There was literally nothing else in the mental horizon of a Carolingian aristocrats. That naturally, Charlemagne was pretty darn good at that because he, as we were saying before, he conquered basically the largest amount of land since Roman times in Europe, and he affirmed the same Roman Empire again by papal hands, of course, which also Frederick had been crowned by. But in this sense, also, Frederick was trying to stress, right, the primal, not just his legitimacy, right, as an emperor, looking at the very origin of what was understood as the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, he would look further up to Augustus, we'll see now, but also in the sense, because in Augustus' times there wasn't a pope nor an emperor taking actually his crown from him, if not as Christ, Lord of the universe, but in this sense delegating other power that would delegate still imperial majesty and is existing always, just like in times before Christ, just because of God's will. And in the Davidic kingship, of course, stressing, first of all, the idea of the chosen people. This was something was crystalline clear, not just in the Old Testament as far as the Jews were concerned, but among the Romans and among the Franks, right? Just after the Jews, the chosen people par excellence, according to their own specific identity, because they stress this continuously, were the Romans and the Carolingians, and the Franks. Or at least, yes, let's say we can say the Carolingians, we can say the Frankish dynasty, the Frankish monarchy, since Merovingian times. They thought they were, of course, rulers of a chosen people, right? And this whole thing, as you know, made a lot of sense as far as the Romans were concerned, because Christ had been born exactly under Augustus, so this was all a providential law, responded to a providential logic of evangelic spread under the, in the time of the at least earthly restoration of the Golden Age. It would happen with Augustus, with Christ's birth, and thus the coming of the new Apollo and so on. So all of this was reinforced in the in a deeply, even more militarized world, at least like the Carolingian one had been at the moment of the properly repristination of an empire, the Renovatio Imperii, stressing the fact the identification of Charlemagne, and at this point Frederick II, with David himself. So the most important monarchic model, fundamentally. So in this manifesto that Frederick laid out in Jerusalem, there is the adaptation of the text to a biblical style. We hear that, for example, quote, "All those who honor the true faith shall from henceforth know, and shall publish it far and wide to the ends of the earth, that he who is blessed for all time has visited us, has brought deliverance to his people, and has raised up an horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David." Right. So in here, naturally, the ecumenicity of the empire stressed again. They didn't think like it was just, they knew there were other peoples. At this point, I made a video about what was the kind of the European knowledge of Asia before the arrival of the Mongols. We're talking actually about now the same years. But, of course, the the Romanity of the empire extended on all the territories that had been part of Rome and were continued to be part of that, and at a time which Rome would be, say, at least ideally, under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor. That naturally had more than a difficulty in controlling Rome, especially at this point. It was never achieved, but still, the empire was the same Roman one spiritually, because also the empire protected Rome. Right, the Papal States technically were not part of any earthly polity. Right, they were St. Peter's patrimony. Right, so they belong somewhere else. Right, as you understand. But this should not be understood merely in the sense political territorial sense, but also in the sense that there was a shared power over the same Christians that inhabited there of the papacy and the emperor. Also, this is not touched by Frederick's ideology. Now he's talking about something else, but it's important to stress, because otherwise you think that they were two rigidly, territorially separated things. It's not quite the same, right? At least conceptually. Then in practice, yes, there were great problems in that sense, but we should at that point understand also in what properly a medieval polity ruled like. Right, in practice. Now, when Frederick came back to Italy after the crusade, he heard a triumphal sermon in the Bitonto Cathedral in Apulia. This sermon was delivered by Nicholas of Bari, another the most important Apulian city, which again explicitly compared specifically the Hohenstaufen dynasty with that of King David, right, to establish a further continuity, a dynastic one, a genetic one. This is also important as far as the Old Testamentary quote is concerned, because naturally the bloodline was crucial, in as much as, traditionally it was really believed that our power is also deriving from, a way it manifests, of course, from our genetic base, right? So this sermon is quite interesting because says that it equates Frederick Barbarossa with Jesse, the founder of David's line, and Frederick II himself with Jacob's son Judah, ancestor of Christ, and one of his prefigurations in medieval biblical exegesis. Right, so this was also interestingly understood on a traditional ground as Frederick, expecting his descendants to be the ones who would be able to essentially save the world, right? Which was the old kind of traditional idea that now I don't feel to digress on because it's complicated, but it's again very much directed at the papacy, because even though of course it was understood that there had to be a union, in fact, also as far as imperial power was concerned, between the spiritual and temporal power, so everything had to be one. We will see it now again. In order to save yourself, you could just you would have had to receive God's grace through your own work. In other words, without that, you wouldn't need a intermediate as the papacy, not really as the church, because the church would function still as like that. The Holy Ghost would always pass through the church, but it's as if the emperor at that point had been, in fact, within the church, and this was very important, of course, for an excommunicated emperor at that moment to say, and to be able again to essentially save the world alone, right? So he wasn't really speaking of himself; he was speaking of his offspring, right? So he could have not compared himself with Christ just per se, even though there was a lot of Christ mimicking. Think about the Caesar papism of the Byzantines, More of that later. But the important here was affirming that Frederick's line was legitimate on the ground of blood as well, and so also on the quality of this essentially sacred blood, right? Anointed blood, and so with a specific role that could not quite be say declassed by, let's say, whoever was in office as a pope. This was the implication as well. And then expanding upon Jacob's blessing to Judah in Genesis 49, and coupling this with the messianic Psalm 110, the sermon concluded itself in this way, quote, "The scepter shall not pass from the hand of the Lord Frederick, nor the mace from between his feet," which means, nor the imperium from his hairs, until he comes to whom it belongs, that is, Christ in judgment. So Frederick's lineage will rule until the end of the world, essentially, because the royal dignity was his from the day he was born. The sermon said, like Christ's in all his representatives, kings, and emperors. Right, so of course there was a big deal of Caesaropapism in here as well, and the most important thing being that there couldn't be anyone essentially eliminating the dynasty for how it had been affirmed now in his merits, in his deeds, in his role, right, as imperial rulers, and this appeared really to be crucial in, again, that specific circumstance. So it's a divinely commissioned imperium, which was not, in fact, even a new concept in the Swabian house at that point. In fact, Godfrey of Viterbo, that we have met in that video about, again, the imperial glory and its ideological revival at the time of the Hohenstaufen, and who was essentially an Italian from Viterbo, is just north of Rome in central Italy, and he had been educated at Bamberg in Franconia, so there with an important reference to the land in which to which the imperial grandeur was connected historically, with just a great center of learning German standards. And Godfrey had subsequently worked as chaplain and chancery official, first for Frederick Barbarossa and Henry VI, respectively Frederick's grandfather and father. Right, so there was a legacy, an ideological legacy running in through almost the veins of the Hohenstaufen political culture. So in his works, we've seen them. Godfrey proclaimed that the Hohenstaufen, that were called literally Imperialis prosapia, that is to say, properly imperial stock, imperial family, as such, descendants, was the last and greatest of all imperial lines in world history. Right, because of course the end of time has to come. This was a bit kind of double-edged in a way, because naturally, the Frederick II experienced a dramatic propaganda against him. Right, the best of papal political culture was basically harnessed against him. He also put around a lot of propaganda against the popes who opposed him, etc. But the idea is that he was compared to Satan. Now, Satan has to come to rule in the world before the end time, when Christ will essentially crush him. And the stressing that, of course, you would be the last dynasty on earth also meant the risk of losing that kind of purity, because the last of the ages was, in fact, the one in which the standards were going down. But the point was still, of course, in the practicality of political affairs, the fact of literally preventing that fall to happen. Because if the empire and the church had remained steady, Satan may have come, but at that point he would have been defeated by the forces of light. Right, so nobody really knows how the storming of the Asgard has to occur and how the hour of the wolf has to come, the age of the wolf. However, the idea is that a great deal of advantage can come if the Asen are strong, right? So if the empire, this as I understand, sacred line, so it's still the idea of about divine descent, is strong. And in fact, the Saint Godfrey was stressing that, at least politically speaking, Frederick and his lineage fit directly as heirs of the Caesars, right? And that they were destined to rule until the end of the ages, right? So the Romanity of the empire, of course, was out of discussion. The Roman Empire had been the one that had fulfilled the Indo-European prophecy of repersonating the Golden Age briefly between the Bronze and the Iron one, so the last one. And this, again, had been incidentally the same. The Empire of the Caesars, specifically, you see there that there is an ethnic, clanic reference to the gens, Julia, etc., had been a matter of divine descendancy, because they believed they descended from Mars, from Venus. So that was a powerful, idea in the first place. So here, the Swabians were essentially creating their own mythology, and essentially claiming to be as fitting, at least morally, spiritually, and thus deserving essentially the same Roman imperial power, authority. And that's the reason why they were Holy Roman Emperor by law, legally, even if they were excommunicated. That the thing is that they had been, it had been done in the first place, so it could not be denied in the first place. These were really God chosen, right? Except, of course, the genealogical origins of the Swabians are a bit lost into the fog of history. Doesn't matter, right? At that point, you could not claim to have been descended from a pagan god, namely. But the idea that the world, in its, again, all genetic manifestations, even in the fallen kind, produced its best from, in fact, a good stock, and the one that was closer to God still fit this picture, right? This was fair to claim at the time in the first place. So Godfrey of Viterbo is likely to have been the source for Henry VI's ideas in this line that were presented for the plan of literally an hereditary empire in 1196, when eventually he died, by the way, which was the point of all, right? The idea is that they would literally have to pass the empire down to the generations genetically, right? The empire was notoriously elective, or at least the emperor was crowned by the Pope and elected by the Roman people, according to the procedure, without which could not really be emperor. But of course, at least the German dimension of the empire entailed the election, right? So at least the Germans had something to say about that, at least as far as the royal authority was concerned, and also this extra kind of limbo between that and the imperial crowning, that was the kingship of the Romans, right? Which is also quite eloquent, and that was also, well, it normally came just as being elected king of Germany, especially at this point, but it still signified the power of the locals. And this was, however, in a traditional sense, transcendable, meaning that if the dynasty was so fit that everybody would recognize it as such just by their own virtue, well, genetically could simply inherit the empire. There was, just think about what this means in practice for a person to have properly, even having been raised with this idea. It's extremely powerful. And again, it was of a concern because, as you know, of all the mess that happened after Henry VI's death, Otto of Brunswick, the assassination of Philip was It was Frederick's uncle, Henry's brother, the civil war, the fact that Otto invaded Sicily, the young Frederick even landed in Calabria opposing himself, because he was arriving from southern Italy. So moments of dramatic upheaval. Germany turned into, again, a mess. This was the moment in which basically even the German church bailed out from the Imperial, from supporting the emperor just per se. So the end time, the sense that the more things degenerate, and at least the more you are invested to hold, right, and to become of higher standards, is proposed. It's ideologically stressed this, the more you're challenged in a way, at least at this point, and in the case of the uncertainty of a succession, and so on. Later on, in Frederick II's reign, the aforementioned Davidic theme was developed a bit further. And it's fascinating that Frederick attributed to it some properly Italian character, because he described expressly Jesi, right, his birthplace that was in the Mark of Ancona in the Apennines, the Adriatic watershed, as, quote, our Bethlehem. Right, there is also a spurious saying that sounded by Frederick something like, if God had seen my kingdom of Sicily, he would have not have born in Bethlehem, in Palestine. That's, he said. That is one of the most powerful lines. Unfortunately, it's spurious, but it kind of makes sense in terms also of the extreme pride that Frederick had towards his kingdom of Sicily. In fact, he went on to adapt the prophet Misha's teaching, as quoted in the second chapter of St. Matthew, which sounds like, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, you are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel. Right, so this was all transposed in a Roman, and in this case Italian, theater, where Jesi was basically the birthplace of the princeps of the Roman Empire, right? And so there was something here also, because Jesi was like not a particularly important place, like Bethlehem was not a particularly important place. So the idea is that there was, consider banally, Frederick had been born on December the 26th, so just the day after Jesus, plus this his birth at Jesi had been a public thing, because she was old. For that age, she was 40, right? And so they didn't believe she was actually pregnant. And she had her labor, well, not literally called unpopular, but in a tent in the square of Jesi with some noble women who had to witness inside the tent the actual real deal, because naturally they were void. Against Frederick II, as I said before, it was the worst propaganda. Said they had picked just a random kid, a baby from the place, and they had fabricated the labor and all this stuff. But no, that had been an event, right? And there was something, again, momentous about this birth, the heir of the Hohenstaufen, the December 26th. This mostly happened also after Frederick became more than in fact a minor, and he took the reins himself. But they cared a lot about astrology. I really understand why people think that there was a time in which Christianity ruled and astrology was forbidden. I mean, astrology was all one with astronomy, and it was present literally everywhere. Like every polity had astrologers paid that were just perfectly legal, also under canon law. And the only point is that, of course, they didn't have to contradict the Bible, but everybody used them, right? So there were all these symbolisms about this ruler that calculated the various prophecies, what this guy would have done, right? They truly believed in the possibilities could be, like the world could end, right, anytime soon. There was always made videos about that, about the Joachimite prophecies, the fact that they thought, in fact, Frederick was the Antichrist. There is Salim Bene of Parma who says, I hate his guts, but, I gotta admit that, when he died, the world is still here, so he was not the Antichrist. And this kind of things, again, Frederick made really his times. This is such a huge character that cannot even properly be framed correctly, even biographically. There's just really Abulafia, and especially Kantorowicz, of course, that talked about him, but he is really like, you think that everything is being said about him. The more you research about him, there's something new that comes out. In any case, in another sense, on another regional theater, on the Baltic, right, the projected conquest of Prussia by the Teutonic Order was fitted ideologically within the Catholic meaning of the empire, right, as a proper religious and political protector of mankind until the end time, right? So I made a video about the Teutonic Order. You can make more of that. And that fundamentally these knights had been born, knights monks in Palestine, as a sort of hospital for the German pilgrims. Then they had developed, in a military sense, they had been first settled in Hungary at the easternmost extreme. The Hungarian king didn't like the fact that this began to carve kind of a seigneury on its own. He kicked them out. And they were sent by Frederick, in theory with the permission as vassals properly of the kingdom of Poland, that had sought help from the emperor to tame the Prussians and other pagan people that still lived in the Baltic. So much so that the history of the Teutonic Order naturally passes through the Diet of Rimini in 1226. This was on the Adriatic. Frederick, on that occasion, authorized the conquest of Prussia, literally sub monarchia imperii, right, which stressed the fact that basically there was no intermediary between the Teutonic Order and the empire, so much so to stress properly the Teutonic loyalty towards the emperor, right, and even skipping, in theory, the papacy, not quite. However, that the Grand Master Hermann von Salza, the loyalty to the emperor was quite strong, again, mostly because the Outremer felt abandoned, right? There was a general sense that at least the Teutonic Knights were lucky to be within an imperial context in the first place. They basically adapted them to Prussia, and they built there one of the most powerful states of the Middle Ages, as you know. It's mostly another story, but it was particularly important to stress the fact that now Frederick could even literally launch, could have this power, at least on the Crusaders, right, as a sort of even a German national power. At this point, he was actually in positive terms with the papacy. At least, the papacy was okay with the mission. So the Duke of Mazovia in Poland really was, because it was mostly in his frontier things, operations had to take place. We will see this in another So the most important thing is that the Teutonic enterprise was placed squarely within the universal and everlasting imperial mission of Rome. Bear in mind, what were they thinking? We think that the Teutonic Knight was something more like, say, distant from the Romanity of the enterprise. Absolutely not, as we will read now, because the imperial mission of Rome had been established by Augustus Caesar just at the time as Christ was born into the world, as we were saying before. So this properly conferred the authority legally, morally, whatever, for the ultimate goal of all history, to save mankind in this mission, right? Again, the expansion of Christendom, even through arms, in the pagan Baltic was seen, of course, as that, right? And the Christian world had just to expand it, to take over. And in fact, in Rimini, Frederick issued the same words: God has sublimely constituted our empire over the kings of the earth, and has extended the limits of our sovereignty through the diverse latitudes of the world, in order to glorify his name throughout the ages, and to propagate the faith among the peoples, just as he provided the sacred Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, for the purpose of spreading the gospel. So our administration, our government, is anxious to bring about not only the conquest but also the conversion of the heathen nations. This is a beautiful phrase, right? So here it's the direct parallelism between Frederick's action, the one of the Teutonic Knights, and Augustus, Rome, Christ, the gospel, right? And it couldn't really be otherwise, right? We say Holy Roman Emperor again because it's a bit of a repetition, right? The empire is holy by definition. The imperium would suffice, right? But stressing the fact that this empire was sacred in the first place was naturally very important in a time like the Middle Ages, where, of course, tradition had already felt to have been degenerating over time, if anything, because the same Roman Empire had declined and all. And so now, imagine it from the perspective of those times. In the last couple of hundred years, Western Europe had boomed, right? And at this point, the Swabians had been the most powerful, rulers as Holy Roman of that word as Holy Roman Emperors. So everything was incredibly important as far as they were, of course, recognized univocally now in the office, at least, of Holy Roman Emperors, between an excommunication and the other, which again couldn't alter the nature of the empire itself, right? If anything, the degree, the intensity, the success, right? But this was all one also with the church, because they overlapped, right? You cannot have an empire in a church. They are all one. As long as there is a church, there is an emperor that has to protect it everywhere. So in at this time in history, like wherever Christians were in the Horn of Africa, as far as China, this was still the idea. It's a global power, and it cannot be anything else. If a power is not global, it's not sacred. Just for those who whine today about the terrible imperialism, right, of any, but mostly just the American one, because people, for some reason, have decided that other countries do not want to do the same. It's just the terrible US that want to do that, and instead they should at least bow to the first power on earth, because whatever it is, it can exist only because God wants that, right? So, and kind of disintegrating it just for the sake of it, as if other powers weren't doing actually much worse, just by definition, because we all do something wrong. In case you didn't notice, well, it's just the new religion of the lesser people, and of lesser peoples, lesser cultures, lesser countries, and so on. But in any case, whatever the meaning of all these messianic references in in Frederick's ideology? Well, in the emperor's letters, surely the useful tradition that of the emperors as protectors of the Roman Church was not neglected, right? Of course, there was a lot of opportunism because of the circumstances, again, of not real great distrust, let's say, between the two powers. But still, it was one of the first, actually the very first duty to fulfill for an emperor, right? Protecting the Roman Church. There cannot be an empire in the world that doesn't protect the Roman Church. If it doesn't, it's going to collapse. Now, for example, Frederick, it surely was genuine in his desire to defend the Church. I mean, from heresy, which, let's remember, was really a big deal in those years, where really, the Pope, but also the lay authorities made really an astounding job at putting heresy down. You're talking about vicious, communistic, Gnostic, radically violent, and unspeakably oppressive systems, where people complain about the Church. They had copied everything, including Inquisition, except they were using it with a fucked up ideology, which is also the cause why they were exterminated in the end. And of course, just those who were more radically so, because it was full of heretics, but there was a way to salvage most of them, even just souls, which is a church affair, but you do need the lay force, so in the Imperial one as well. The problem in that moment of clash with the papacy is that any pope, any preacher, or any inquisitor could be regarded as heretic. I mean, even Frederick had been regarded as an heretic, right? Again, this depends on the person. We are fallen kind, we all sin, and you could never know to which point, especially to the highest spheres, like the greatest burden would make the soul shift towards darker place, right? So any tolerance in that regard would have seen as a sacrilege, rightfully, against Christ's word, which upheld the authority of kings and emperors alike. There are lots of silly voices, right, that I don't want to even know where they stand from, historiographically, because they are irrelevant ipso facto, that told you at some point that Frederick may have been an atheist. Well, if you think so, I suggest you stop studying history entirely, because, the problems come only from you actually learning anything of that. But if you think you're somehow historically literate and you think literally that Frederick was an atheist, it means that, of course, as most people think to be literate in history, you do not even know where history began, so there is some much deeper personal, moral, and cultural problem at the root. You have to mostly look at your childhood, your family, the institutions you attended, whatever, because it's not normal to think something like that, right? It may be a sign of mental disease. In any case, Frederick was actually, he would believe the only possible religion that existed in the world. And if you don't understand what this means when you think that there was Christianity or Islam or other religions, that's also another warning sign about what the nature of the problem really is, right? I do not address you to my history of religion, that is, but, by this point should be clear. So I made so many videos. It's not just what I upload every day that you should be listening to if you care about this channel. If anything, because everything I say is interconnected, so you can't really listen to a video without understanding the others, because I also start from the assumption that whenever I speak, at least people have followed a part of my work. That's at least how I'm habituated at university. I don't pretend it to the absolute, but still to a level of decency as far as history is concerned herself. Frederick was equally educated in the notion sustained by Roman law that an emperor was virtually lex animata, which in Latin means the living law, right? It's an obvious concept that has to do with the fact that the Imperium, the God-given Imperium, is won through personal virtue, through which God's grace, the Holy Ghost, arrives and provides you with this power. In other words, if you behave in a certain way, you receive or not receive power on the basis of how successful or unsuccessful the thing is, respectively. So if you are the Holy Roman Emperor, so the ruler of this world, if you want to attain absolute power, you basically would just take to act, and every action of yours would immediately translate into order. We're talking about lex animata, because in theory this order also through the Aristotelian, Thomistic system would be something like the unmoved mover, right? If you are perfect, you don't even need to move. Everything is just like the world has understood would work anyway. So it's just Clausewitz's concept of absolute war. The idea that wouldn't even at that point be the need for that war to be fought, because you would know in advance everything about the ratios involved, the strain. So, in other words, if you move, so if you act, if you think, you just immediately are making the law living. This is naturally a metaphor in practice to say that, whatever you think or say as an emperor can have a specific value as far as the juridical system is concerned. You can make law yourself, you can issue new laws. I made a video especially about the Constitutio Puritatem by Frederick, which exemplifies how actually in the Kingdom of Sicily you find the only case in common law in which practically the emperor could issue a new law ex novo, right? Because common law said basically that there is just a pre-ordered natural law, the communities have it, and the emperor, any earthly authority is there just to safeguard them, just a bit like protecting the church, to make the example at another level. And the emperor had to just make justice among people, but people that have intrinsically their own free power as freemen. That's the concept. So you if you're truly the emperor, it's already because these freemen recognize you some power, because you are just up to those standards. And again, as you act more righteously, more people will rate you positively and will obey. Right? That's the concept. Frederick, however, on the base of some say prodromes, at least in the Norman Swabian juridical tradition in Sicily, because this was technically the most centralized polity, right, an institution in Western Christendom, even more than the Kingdom of England, could basically issue a law that was simply an addition, right, that basically did not exist. It could be made ex novo. That is to say, not to, let's say, because issuing a law ex novo saying you have to do this, no, people will say, but this is untraditional. Like, we don't have to obey what you say ex novo, because you are here just to protect us. That's what the emperor has to do, is make justice as far as our quarrels are concerned within us, and just protecting us militarily. Right? Any other intervention is basically doesn't have any juridical foundation, tradition. Frederick went as far, this is the limit, right, of it throughout the Middle Ages, but truly the exception, saying that at least if there was a lacuna in the text, say in the religious, in the juridical theory, the emperor could simply intervene by creating a new law. Right? Naturally, this didn't have to essentially influence, at least in theory, anything. It could not interfere with any local custom, but it was legal, right? And this is something at least Frederick managed to have passed during his reign, which was not an easy one in Sicily, but still one in which that centralized system worked pretty damn well. It's kind of ironic that Sicily would eventually, just in the modern age, at least very late, but become one of the least governable places as far as the Ancien regime was concerned. But at this point, it actually had very high, as long as, at least until well, okay, I made my videos about medieval Sicily. I will not repeat myself, but this was the peak of it, the peak of the entire Ancien regime kind of, let's say, medieval juridical theory, interventionism from the side of an emperor or of a ruler, right? And this he did, by the way, in the vest of King of Sicily, but still provided with some, as King of Sicily, with some prerogatives that were drawn from the Imperial majesty. This is even more interesting because it's as if the degree of power he enjoyed as King of Sicily was, however, institutionally within the same realm, as high as the one of Holy Roman Emperor on Sicilian own account. This is fascinating. But again, I made that video about the Constitutio Puritatem. You can check that out. Perhaps I have to re-upload it at some point because of I blurred the pictures, but it doesn't matter. Like, it's the content that matters. It's all there. There was not really... There is a debate about this regarding especially Frederick Barbarossa's policy, especially in the Italic kingdom, because at that time Sicily wasn't yet there in the hands of the Hohenstaufen, even though the Germans were always trying to sneak it, to take it away from the Normans. That is to say, Frederick I had been much more of a legal autocrat than, at least politically, behaviorally, than Frederick, right? Frederick II. Frederick I was a very fiery man. He was very energetic, very impulsive too, right? Very aggressive. Frederick, his grandson, was instead pretty darn cold, right? He wore basically his grandfather's masks, especially as far as the clash against the Lombards was concerned, with massacres, things like that, because he was extremely cold, calculating, rational, right, to an extreme that probably hardly any other medieval ruler really can look at. And therefore what he was doing was still very much adapted to the situation, what he thought was necessary in that situation. He had as many phases as the kingdoms that he ruled, right? Completely different attitude, say, in Germany compared to the one he had in Sicily, or the one they had in Italy, or the one he had as King of Jerusalem, right? So for each of these peoples, he had a specific character to play, and that's quite fascinating. And if you look at all his Sicilian legislation, as well as the German one, because naturally he cared, as we've seen, Germany was a bit, derailing at that point from Frederick's rule, but Frederick had an enormous pride as a German ruler about his Swabian ancestry. He had a particular love for Alsace, right? That said, it's our favorite German land, a bit like Apulia in the south. Like he really had these favorite places where he would like to stay. He wasn't in Germany very frequently, but even there he stressed the greatness of the imperial office, naturally, in its guardianship of law, right? The fact that everything revolved around justice really is what made, first and foremost, a medieval ruler. Also because the juridical prerogatives of these monarchs made them make really a considerable amount of money. You have control law, you control the courts, the tribunals, you basically could really encumberate an enormous amount of wealth, right? And that's why the eternal problem was the fact that the more you privatize and the more local communities would claim a sort of customary control over the local justice. That's why, for example, Frederick was selling these rights in Germany and actually increasing them in Sicily. All right, he beheaded lots of when the papal army invaded southern Italy. Lots of noblemen naturally rebelled to him there too. So when he came back, because that was during the crusade, he literally made a massacre. Like, he took out these guys one by one, and naturally he confiscated all their goods in the process. So on the base, again, especially of the secular Norman administration, that was a much more profitable place to rule from, to get resources from. And it was like very demanding, by the way. Considered it was a very fast-paced need for troops, right? That mostly were German mercenaries at this point, because the feudal institutions were gratless in terms of recruitment, as you know, by the 13th century, were evaporating a bit everywhere. And all these troops, like especially heavy cavalry, that had been reaching its peak in the 13th century, so were really costly, right? So it was all this continuous need of money. There is a beautiful Landfriede that Frederick II issued at Mainz in 1235. We've seen what the Landfriede is. It was essentially a peace ordinance. It's typical, probably public authority, royal policy, let's say. And this was, an old principle, again, that peace can be achieved only in arms, right? So Frieden in Germanic was this idea, just like for the Romans, civis pacem para bellum. So, of course, the fact that imperial power, as we were saying before, had to just tame had to solve injustice, had to curb the criminals, had to maintain the unity of the empire. And this Landfriede was issued for the whole empire by Frederick in 29 chapters. And what is beautiful mostly is the motivation that is laid out in the prologue, which really makes you understand the strive right behind, the medieval governmental capacity to keep things together, and especially in a time like that was going seriously, in a difficult way. Consider that 2 years later, the Edictum in Favorem Principum would be issued. So that's when, basically, after the rebellion of his son Henry, everything had gone lost, right? The German princes had usurped so much in terms of public authority that Frederick himself began to basically to sell out stuff just to cash, because he understood that the system was crumbling in many ways, at least considering that he was based still in Italy and he had to take care of very important issues, including the war against the Lombards, and all that could be done effectively only from the Kingdom of Sicily at that point. But the prologue here at Mainz in 1235 is beautiful. It says, having obtained the throne of imperial eminence, right? So he was a ruler he was a princeps, remember that, a primus inter pares, according to what Augustus himself thought in our world of free Romans, right? So he was just the hegemonic ruler, right, by the command of divine providence. Again, God was delegating him, as we've seen. We have taken care to strengthen our plans for the government of our subjects with the double bond of peace and justice, so that the renown of our name has something with which to promote both its own glory and the welfare of our subjects. For the authority of the ruler will especially be fortified when in the observation of peace and in the execution of justice it is as fearful to the wicked as it is welcome to the obedient. So of course the forces of evil must be completely annihilated, and the light shall prevail. Right? The gates of hell shall not prevail. So our deal is to, first of all, granting peace, right, and justice that cannot exist one without the other, and the purpose is naturally the prosperity of the world, because again the idea is that if the world is ruled in such a way, it is capable of becoming more powerful and therefore not succumbing to the forces of evil. And the actual medium here is the emperor, the medium with God. So the more these forces are present, and the more you can curb the evil ones. Naturally, the evil ones can also, as the Ouroboros myth, right? The idea is that again, the more there is power in theory, and also the more dangerous things become, which is true. Just think about nuclear weapons nowadays. But this is just for saying that, however, those work in a deterrent form, right? And that's also what at the time technically warfare was for, right? That's why all these powers were at war normally, because it was the only way to maintain order in the first place, right? And to actually bring the world to where we are now, which they kind of succeeded in doing anyway. So that's really remarkable. So peace and justice. Of course, it's a rhetorical statement, but a real one, right? Maybe we have heard it so often that we start saying, we start even using it ourselves in pretty relativistic terms, like people that want peace in Ukraine by saying, I don't know, a genocide of 2 million Ukrainians. Well, sure, not send weapons, because otherwise you're a greedy animal that wants just war and using it. This is in fact, exactly the people that in the 13th century would have been burnt at the stake. And which, not saying anything here, but it's an idea maybe for some other time. I don't know which one exactly. In any case, this is in many ways the concept. If you're not able to maintain power, it is still your fault anyway. So it's also here always a double-edged sword, and this cannot be. It's all about how you use it, right? And how you will use it, not just in theory you can. Right? So that struggle, the entire traditional religion is founded on the doctrine of struggle and victory, and of course, this has to do with conflict as just inherent in the nature of mankind, right? So this was in many ways the exact point that the German emperors saw as their duty. Let's say, apart from the protection of the church, right, which is actually present in the same Landfriede of Mainz, but fits, according to the imperial ideology, first and foremost within the idea that you have to pacify the entire world, right? So that the protection of the church is somehow obvious in the endeavor. But always remember, this is Frederick II who is talking this from a delicate situation with the church, and so you should always read it also in those terms, right? When the German emperors were excommunicated, normally the sense was that, okay, we'll keep, doing as if nothing happened. Not really like sometimes they declared heretic the popes themselves, etc., but it was less successful as a general enterprise, and generally speaking they were mostly content in stressing their own Caesar-papistic power, and so mostly trying to recover Roman law that was all about centralization, and so with the idea that everything had to depend from the emperor and from this as central rule as possible, right? That here, as you understood, they were also trying to make it dynastic, to try to confer to it more stability according to feudal law, and generally speaking, the practice of the time. In any case, we will keep looking at these topics because they're really interesting. Frederick's rule is just, as we're noticing before, an endless pool of information, of inspiration. Sometimes even too much fragmentarily so, because there is so much stuff to say that you have to go step by step. I don't know how many videos I made on him, a considerable amount, I think like 10 or something, but it's just too few, right, of course, and we have to go bit by bit at the same time, because it's really important to dimension this ruler better, and to really appreciate what imperial power was about, what medieval politics was about, and also how difficult, right, it was, and how important the deal was also to make sense. Because if you make sense, you also convince people. You also make things work. People are going to obey, right? Are going to say, well, this is what we need. Let's just go by it, right? This is right fundamental in importance. Now we will see again this in another video. For today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.